So I'm going to share a bit about my contribution to our anthology on the philosophy of psychedelics. My chapter is titled Altered Consciousness After Descartes, Whitehead's Philosophy of Organism as Psychedelic Realism. So in summary, what I'm doing in this chapter is offering a reading of Descartes' Meditations that interprets his experience as a psychedelic trip, a bad trip, as it were, but with signs of hope, indications of another way. And I turned to Whitehead to pursue one such other way, looking at Whitehead's philosophy of organism, or otherwise known as his process philosophy or process relational philosophy, and showing how a philosophy of organism allows us to undo the dualisms that Descartes left us with in order to pursue a more organic worldview and indeed um, a more psychedelic worldview. So the psychedelic realism piece is an attempt to bring a philosophical lens to the psychedelic experience to try to elucidate and understand what is transpiring um, when we alter our consciousness using any of the many psychedelic compounds, chemical catalysts that are available. They each have their own unique ontological implications, right? So I don't talk too much about each psychedelic and the specific implications for philosophy of the experiences that they generate. I'm merely trying to provide a philosophical justification for doing so. So that would, be future work to do a kind of psychedelic phenomenology, as it were, which of course um, Peter Jostet Hughes has written a bit about a sort of psychedelic phenomenology of each of these compounds and the unique effects that they produce. That's a different type of work. I'm trying to justify that type of work. So I begin the chapter by addressing the way in which Descartes' mind, matter, or thought extension dualism, the way it has continued to affect the practice of modern science and indeed modern neuroscience in its research on consciousness or on attention or on emotion or on the various ways that it can uh, categorize human experience in order to investigate um, a particular aspect of it. Even though modern science, contemporary neuroscience, would want to distance itself from Descartes' dualism and from any notion of a disembodied soul, there's still, I would argue, a sort of Cartesian residue in the what gets called the representationalist paradigm, whereby the brain is understood to be some kind of information processor or symbolic processor, or that the brain is basically in the business of producing an internal representation of an external world that is perceived through the senses and then processed according to some neural code. And this paradigm drives neuroscience, cognitive science, philosophers of mind busy themselves trying to assist in this scientific pursuit of a representationalist account of what the brain does and what the mind is. But as far as I can tell, it is still Cartesian in form. It might deny that there is a disembodied immortal soul, but it is still describing a situation wherein some kind of, attention or awareness or emotion is transpiring and is correlated with this brain mechanism. But really, in the account given by this type of neuroscience, there's really no explanation for why there should be any awareness at all. We may as well just be zombies, as Chalmers argues. And so while I don't in this paper get too much into this critique of contemporary neuroscience and cognitive science, at least of the representational variety, as residually Cartesian, I don't get into that in this paper. It's also another, you know, area for psychedelic philosophers to engage with and hopefully change some minds. But I set the paper, I set out in the paper with this context because there's a lot of research going on now and among neuroscientists and, um, in the medical sciences, because psychedelics have proven to be powerful treatments for all sorts of things, you know, post-traumatic stress disorder and anxiety and depression, are the ones being researched for the most part now, but there are applications with addiction and, as Michael Pollan would put it, the betterment of well people. So because all this research in the context of a neuroscientific medical complex that is paradigmatically still Cartesian, I think philosophers who have a different understanding of reality that's non or anti-representational and that is psychedelically informed, especially, have something important to contribute to the way that we medicalize the psychedelic experience. Because a certain kind of, neuroscientific explanation of consciousness could have really detrimental psychological and social and economic implications and political implications, right? These things are not, um, only if we were living within a Cartesian universe would we think that we could separate, um, something like our neuroscientific explanations from our political economy and our cultural and religious, um, worldviews. All of this is just anthropologically speaking, and Nicholas Langlitz is an anthropologist who I cite in my paper, who's done ethnographic research on neuroscientists studying psychedelics, and it's very interesting to see the way that they adopt typically this sort of what Langlitz calls a mystic materialism. Um, I encourage you to check out his work, but I think there are other ways of interpreting the psychedelic experience, like Whitehead's philosophy of organism, which is not explicitly designed by Whitehead to give a better account of psychedelic experience, but it was Whitehead's attempt to acknowledge that the universe is far stranger than the mechanistic materialists had assumed, and indeed that it is far more interrelated than the atomistic, individualistic, modern Cartesian understanding had allowed for. There's far more interpenetration. Um, um, there's far more dependent co-origination, uh, as we might say, coming out of a Buddhist orientation. Um, and that's disturbing to our Cartesian habits of mind and ways of um, experiencing and interpreting the world, for modern Western people who find themselves in this Cartesian bind of being a separate solitary self immersed in a world of deterministic mechanical objects. To be in that sort of a bind um, is to be in a state of fear that the other is going to destroy you, and um, it's also to be in a state of kind of servitude to an infinite divine transcendent source, and we'll talk about that in a moment. This infinite divine transcendent source is something that Descartes encounters in the midst of his meditations, in the midst of his psychedelic trip. He also, of course, encounters an evil demon, um, or conjures one himself, perhaps. So, let's transition then into my reading of Descartes in his Meditations on First Philosophy. he tells us that, he he wants to get to the bottom of our knowledge of reality. He wants to understand the very possibility of knowledge itself, which, Kant would then later more explicitly thematize. But Descartes wants to provide an indubitable foundation for our knowledge of nature. And he tries to arrive at this by applying the method of absolute skepticism. Everything that he can doubt, he doubts, and he has to keep reminding himself not to take for granted the evidences of his senses, or the feelings in his body, or his emotions, or not to mistake the patches of color in his visual field for, a real world out there, because really all that we experience directly are these representations in our mind, sensory representations, and conceptual representations. And in that sort of a situation, Descartes realizes we have no certain knowledge of anything outside us in the external world. The earth and the sky could just be illusions. There could be an evil demon with the power to completely uh, construct a world and a body that are not real, but fool me into thinking they are real. And um, Descartes finds himself as if, in a whirlpool that's sucking him down, and um, continues to reflect on all the things that, but in continuing to reflect on all the things that he could not know, he finds that in his very act of doubting, of saying no to his experience, Descartes realizes that he is authenticating his own existence, that he is authorizing his own being, that the cogito, right, the I think, and Descartes' statement, I think I am, which is how he first utters it. It's not really an argument. It's not a therefore. It's not an I think, therefore I am as a sort of deduction or a proof. Um, it's more the description, the poetic description of an intuitive act, of a moral deed that he has accomplished within himself, and that he thinks anyone who reads him can understand how to accomplish in themselves. To say I am is really to utter a sort of magic spell, a sort of ritual incantation that, and here's the turn to God in Descartes' meditations. This utterance of the I am, it makes us aware of that feature of our experience that can't be doubted. Like everything in our sensory experience, everything we experience even about ourselves within our own souls can be doubted. It could all be an illusion. But the doubting itself, Descartes is saying, is evidence of this I, this thinking activity. But as soon as we become aware of that thinking activity, Descartes says, we have to admit that it's limited. We make mistakes all the time. We err. Um, we learn, hopefully, but we also forget. We're limited. We're finite beings. And so he recognizes this, and then also recognizes, intuits, that the very fact that he can uh, see himself as limited means that there must be some idea of an unlimited being that we're able to compare ourselves to. And so Descartes realizes there's this idea of the infinite, this idea of God that is sort of implanted in the core of his own mind, in his own experience. And he's arrived at that experience by doubting everything, realizing his own finitude, and in realizing that finitude, becoming aware of the infinite ground, allowing him to, how do you recognize something as finite unless you have an intuition of the infinite as the background and context that provides for your recognition? So Descartes trying to, you know, he's not trying to rehabilitate the old ontological argument for the existence of God, right? This isn't a deduction. I think, therefore I am. That's not what it means. He means rather to to poetically enact an experience. And he thinks that that experience is a window onto this deeper ground or source, which he interprets in the Catholic terms in which he was raised and his what his social context provided him with. Um, and I think one of the things I try to do then to shift to Whitehead is in the latter part of my chapter to show how the Catholic interpretation of God as an all-powerful, transcendent creator God isn't the only interpretation of the experience that Descartes is describing. And that indeed, for us to heal the mind-matter dualism, the split that Descartes has hewn, we need to reimagine God as involved in the process of nature and reimagine the human soul as involved in the process of nature and reimagine the soul and God as involved in one another's natures, deeply involved, and not just a one-way involvement where we respond to God's action. We act as well, and God has to receive our action, respond to our action. Um, and so Whitehead is shifting us out of this ontotheology in Descartes' philosophy into a more democratic ontology where God shares power, the power to act, with all creatures. And God, indeed, in Whitehead, God becomes a creature as well. We are all creatures of creativity. And what God provides to human experience, though, and to the experience of all other creatures, is a sort of aesthetic lure. And so here's where Whitehead's philosophy intersects with the psychedelic experience. The aesthetic ground of reality, the poetic basis of mind and matter, becomes, I think, inescapably obvious when one has eaten 5 grams of psilocybin mushrooms or taken several hundred micrograms of LSD or um, taken several hits of 5-MeO-DMT. I mean, for those who have had these experiences, it pretty reliably produces a similar type of experience for everyone who takes them. Um, it is no longer possible to imagine reality in dualistic terms, I would argue. And this is a phenomenological claim, and I think we would need to engage in some um, interepistemic dialogue about how everyone else has experienced these things to coordinate our perspectives. But I think it is hopefully something we could agree on as psychonauts, that a dualism between mind and body, a separation between uh, an eternal soul and a mortal, carcass, that somehow soul and body, under the influence of a chemical catalyst like one of these powerful psychedelics, it's that boundary is going to dissolve very quickly, and we need new categories to make sense of that dissolution. And Whitehead's process relational philosophy and his uh, aesthetic ontology and his theology allow us to, I think, at least have a set of categories to apply to very novel and otherwise disordered experiences in order to bring them into coherence with, what we know in modern science and physics and chemistry and neuroscience, of course. So we need these new ontological categories in order to avoid dismissing psychedelic experience and psychedelic phenomenology as merely hallucinatory. We need to take these boundary dissolving experiences seriously and reimagine what we might mean by a neuroscientific explanation of consciousness so that it is consistent with the reality revealed um, under the influence of one of these chemicals. So psychedelics are really a philosophical laboratory, and I think they can be responsibly treated as such. We have a lot to learn from them, and I hope that bringing Whitehead and Descartes into conversation in search of a psychedelic realism, I hope it was fruitful, and I look forward to hearing about what everyone else is working on.